Thank you very much. I'm Richard Jordan, chairman of the conference. I'm going to just introduce Khalid Dawood, who will introduce the speakers. Madam Li Xiaoling, vice president of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, will be the first presenter. She must catch a plane early this evening, so she will entertain two questions. If you write a couple of questions, pass them up to Khalid, who will take two of them, and Madam Li will answer those in response to your question. So, Khalid, thank you very much for moderating the session, and I turn it over to you, and I will return in about 3 minutes.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. Of course, this is a very important topic for different world countries. We're honored to have such a group of experts with us here, each probably with a particular specialization that you're going to tackle with the negative impacts of climate change, particularly when it comes to important topics such as agriculture, deforestation, and many topics that maybe vary between different parts of the world, different regions, depending whether it's a developed country or underdeveloped country or developing country like Egypt, where I come from. But I think that's a very important topic for all of us. And without any further delay, because our first guest, as we have just heard, has a plane to catch, so we'll just move straight to Mrs. Li Xiaoling, who's representing a Chinese NGO, particularly concerned in a country as big as and important as China on the effect of how to provide such a population with the amount of food that we need. And as she will mention in her speech, she will talk to us about their experience in this respect. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, friends, on the occasion of the 60th UN DPI NGO Annual Conference, I'm delighted to be invited as a representative.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Rosalind Peterson. She's the California president and co-founder of the Agriculture Defense Coalition, formed in 2006. She's the California president and co-founder of the Agriculture Defense Coalition, formed in 2006 to protect agricultural crop production from uncontrolled experimental weather modification programs. A very interesting topic, for a non-specialized person like myself. But also very interesting in her CV that we have with you is also her extensive efforts to protect drinking water supplies from toxic chemical contamination in Martinez, California. That's a very interesting topic, of course, and I was actually wondering myself whether you can tackle whether the same experiments that you're holding in California could be extended to other world countries, particularly poor and developed countries like where we come from. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. One of the things that I would like to say is that we are in a global drumbeat right at the moment, talking about climate change and global warming. One of the things that is affected by climate change is agriculture. But some of what we are seeing is man-made, but man-made in a different way than you may guess. Weather modification programs, experimental ones done by private companies, done by the United States government, done by states across the United States, are underway. There's more than 50 of them in operation across the United States. All of these impact agriculture because they change the microclimates needed for agriculture to survive. None of these programs that I know of today, and this is all public record, are available at any time with oversight, agricultural oversight or public oversight. These programs impact agriculture, and there are programs around the world. International corporations are modifying our weather all the time, and they're modifying it in ways that cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Most of it is chemically altered, so that what happens is that we are putting chemicals, ground-based chemicals that are shot into the air, or chemicals coming from airplanes that change and modify our weather. So one of the things that I'm concerned about and that we need to address in the future is how these programs are impacting microclimates needed for our crops to survive and needed for pollination. if we change the growing season, the pollinators may not survive, and also our crops, our flowers, and our tree crops may not get the pollination needed. So one of my areas is looking at this situation to see if we can begin to put under control experimental and other types of weather modification programs. The other issue is that a lot of times we're talking about mitigation for climate change. It's rather an undefined term at this period of time. And so what happens is that many times we're talking about artificially putting chemicals like sulfur or particulates into the atmosphere in what they call geoengineering schemes to reduce and help the planet, supposedly, but help the planet to not go through such a tremendous global climate change and to mitigate global warming. However, the incidence of putting chemicals into our atmosphere is going to change and impact agricultural crop production. And if you take and you put up into our skies chemicals to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth, you are going to begin to reduce crop production. Studies at the University of Illinois on corn crop production show reductions. Without the process of photosynthesis, whereby plants from direct sunlight gain the energy to grow, to produce crops, we are going to find ourselves, if we mitigate in that direction, impacting the crop production not only here in the United States, but worldwide. One of the things that is impacting crop production right now in the United States and reducing photosynthesis and also impacting the ability of solar power panels to generate the type of power that they should is persistent jet contrails. NASA talks about persistent jet contrails as exacerbating global warming because they trap warmth in the atmosphere when they produce cirrus and man-made clouds. NASA also talks about that these aircraft leaving persistent contrails are changing our climate. And when they change our climate to the degree that one jet can leave a persistent jet contrail which will spread across our skies from what this picture up here on my left on the screen looks like, which is a trail left by a jet. That trail can expand to 4,000 kilometers and last for 20 hours. This was unheard of in the early 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't until the late 1980s that there was a change and we started to have persistent jet contrails that persist. NASA studies show that part of our global warming problem could be attributed to these types of contrails and the jets that leave them. So one of the issues as we go through is, how do you like your skies, natural or man-made? And right now we are making man-made clouds, and this is trapping warmth in our atmosphere. The climate change that is produced by these jets, not all jets, mostly some non-commercial, but what happens to our skies is that we start to see the changes. The man-made clouds do trap the warmth, and they increase the humidity. This allows for pests to proliferate, diseases, molds, mildews, funguses, and viruses. This is a man-made cloud, ladies and gentlemen, and these pictures I took myself over Northern California, and this is a burst. This is where a jet left a huge plume, and then this turned in at the end of it to a burst, and this is not normal. Never seen before in our county historically, and I was born and raised there. This is another picture showing the jet trail just before the burst. This is our skies, and I want you to know that what you're seeing now, a lot of times many scientists know, especially at NASA and in other areas, that the skies that we're seeing are not normal cloud formations. These are man-made. And what happens as we reduce the amount of sunlight in a form of global dimming, we reduce the solar power with these type of clouds, and we reduce photosynthesis, which is going to impact agriculture. The pictures look odd, The formations don't look like normal clouds that people have seen before historically. This is another type of man-made cloud, and what we have done and what you're seeing here is we have the photographs from the times that the jet leaves the first trail as a thin, spindly trail to where they form into these different types of cloud formations. All of you can start looking up and seeing this. What happens is that there are experiments, and there's a color, you can see some color in this photograph. And part of what we're doing also is we're sending up canisters. The United States government, NASA, the U.S. Air Force, is sending up canisters into the atmosphere filled with chemicals to modify and experiment with our ionosphere. And when we modify and experiment with our ionosphere up here, we create experiments which they can see through these persistent jet contrails as they stay in the sky for long periods of time, and they can watch the experiments. The type of chemicals they are using are aluminum, barium, strontium, and these canisters are sent up on rockets, and what they do is they superheat the canisters to create experiments in our atmosphere. The experiments can give you colorful auroras, which they talk about as being wonderful. Many times people think that the auroras in Alaska and the ones we see are normal, but there's beginning to be more and more seen across the United States and elsewhere where trimethyl aluminum experiments to make clouds are beginning to impact us. The reason I am concerned for agriculture is that none of these experiments have any public oversight nor agricultural oversight. Our drinking water is impacted because the chemicals are now beginning to show up in our drinking water. In California, the State Department of Health drinking water tests were examined between 1970 and this year, and we found unusual spiking in barium, aluminum, strontium, magnesium, calcium, manganese, and all of these spiked at the same time in various drinking water supplies across the state of California and also in Arizona. So what's happening with these atmospheric tests is that aluminum, as one example, gets into, with increased pollution and acid rain, gets into the root systems of our crop trees and our trees, and it looks like the trees are dying of drought. But they're not. What happens is that the root systems can no longer absorb the water and the nutrients needed to survive. Many of our forests in Redding, California, and other areas are dying. The oak trees, the redwood trees, the Douglas fir across the United States, many areas. We believe that these trees are impacted because they cannot absorb enough water because aluminum is going into their root systems. Also, molds, mildew, and fungus from warmer temperatures produced by persistent jet contrails are also allowing pests and molds to proliferate, also impacting tree health and crop health. The skies that you see up here, it is important to note, have a white haze to them. When crossing the United States 2 days ago, we saw this man-made produced haze all the way across the United States. There were a few real clouds. We saw the persistent jet contrails from the jet windows, and the skies in the white haze looked a lot like this. So one of the things that we need to really look at is that jet fuel emissions contaminate our air, much as automobile exhaust. They know from scientific studies back in the 1970s that they deplete beneficial ozone in the atmosphere by releasing nitric acid. So one of the things that we need to look at is the impact of just jet fuel and just the emissions from jets as well. I want to go on and talk briefly about a couple of issues here that I think are important for everyone to realize. If we don't look at the problems that we are creating, the atmospheric testing programs, in other words, the jet contrails that are warming our climate, and we say to ourselves, we want to geoengineer something else. We want to add more particulates to help global warming or to stop climate change, what we're going to have is we're going to have a pea soup up there of chemicals which are going to be detrimental to our health. It is much better to take the EPA model of the 1970s, where the Environmental Protection Agency was designed to put in regulations to reduce the pollution at its source, to reduce and put caps on how much pollution corporations, cars, automobiles were putting into the atmosphere. One of the things that we're talking about as mitigation is to go into geoengineering plans which add more chemicals to our atmosphere, which are going to get into our drinking water supplies, which are going to get into our soils, which are going to impact our trees. Our trees across the United States, many of them in many areas, especially Mendocino, Lake, and Sonoma County, are dying. They are not healthy as they used to be. And this problem, having traveled across the United States into some other areas, seeing the pictures coming in from across the United States and other countries, we're finding that there's beginning to be an impact from all of these programs and all the chemicals in our skies. And so one of the things we need to think about and work for is reducing pollution. Alan Buckman from the California State Department in Fish and Game talked about microbes, and they're important to the environment. We have at our disposal already some technologies and already the wherewithal to begin to make the planet more healthy and to put it into a different perspective. But if we go to the geoengineering schemes that are waiting in the wings, thousands of them, to put the particulates up and sulfur, then we are going to be in trouble with agriculture across the United States and around the world. It is time that we look at some different solutions that are already here, and it's time that we look at what's happening in our skies and say we don't need to add any more chemicals, we are doing enough. And what these experiments in our skies are doing with atmospheric heating and testing, we don't know, but the chemicals are showing up in our drinking water. So in closing, I would like to say to all of you and to encourage you to know that just what I showed you today is beginning to impact crop production in the United States. And we're seeing higher UV radiation that is burning the tips of our trees and our plants. We see the molds and mildews growing here. And we see all of this, and we hope that all of you will consider before you think of mitigation and just go forward with some of the plans that are being sold to you as almost a cap-and-trade situation, where a corporation like Planktos decides to put iron dust into the Galapagos Islands area. This is a proposal, may have already started, and to create algae blooms. And yes, they're saying, yes, we're going to help the environment because we're going to create these algae blooms for more oxygen. But what happens is it's going to impact the marine life in those areas. As a geoengineering plan, it is going to be sold, the credits for this, the supposed benefits, is to be sold to...
Yes. Okay, I'd like to move on. Interesting questions, a lot of questions. Maybe we can, just one small favor. I mean, handwriting, it's like I'm having some difficulty. I mean, I know it's an intellectual matter, but I mean, please help me. I'd like actually to start, it's a question that came up to my mind when Dr. Peterson was speaking about the effect of the Chemtrails and all these matters. We had a question from Helen Mary, doesn't really say where it comes from, but it says, with the negative consequences of climate warming so evident, how does all the atmospheric pollution from warfare contribute to a solution? Just happened to me when you were speaking about California and the effect of the jets that are flying over California. Again, what about the effects of the jets flying over Iraq every day? I'm sure they're doing a lot of sorties there, you know, and I was wondering whether the pollution in Iraq is just one major side problem to the major human disaster that we're seeing in places there. But basically, don't you think that warfare is also affecting our climate change and warming issues besides the direct effect that you can see in Western rich countries like the United States? Thank you.
Yes. I do believe that the planes, the jets that fly everywhere, not only over Iraq but in all countries, are contributing to climate change and contributing to the air pollution that we have that impacts crops and agriculture. And it is a serious problem. A while ago I had a slide up there to show some of the impacts of jet fuel emissions. And the jets that are flown worldwide with different formulations are impacting us greatly around the world. And many of the slides that you saw in the pictures, the pollution and those persistent contrails are in many, many countries around the world.
Thank you very much. Another interesting question that's coming in, and probably I'd like to leave it up to you, maybe whoever wants to answer this question, concerning the cost of technology. Do you think technology can play a serious role in solution towards global warming, or will the need be to act now with responsibility be the most redeeming and effective actions? If so, is there more we can do at the same time to double the effectiveness, like creating more jobs, issues like that? So it's basically, technology is a very expensive matter, and I'm wondering, with all your expertise here, you can answer me about this question, whether it's the only viable solution to treat this serious problem that we have concerning climate change.
We have a lot of technologies, but also we have a lot of things that have already been invented that we can use. So some of the technologies are here today. Microbes are here today, which can be used to help our planet, to clean pollution, to do a lot of things for us. And so what we have to do is we have to know that there is some technology that already exists. The other issue is that we cannot, out of fear, trade one technology for another, because the solution of the one technology may not be as beneficial as we may believe. For example, in California, there's a bill right now to ban incandescent light bulbs. And yet, we may be trading one pollution problem for another, because fluorescent light bulbs contain mercury. And one of the things is, if you break a mercury bulb in your house or the room it's in becomes a toxic site, a hazmat site. You can't use your vacuum cleaner to vacuum it up, because your vacuum cleaner has to be impounded because it becomes dangerous to use in the future. One of the things that's happening in California is pollution from mercury, and from a lot of mercury getting in from waste sites and dump sites, getting into water supplies and impacting the fish. So what happens in this case is, are we trading one problem, in other words, incandescent bulbs, to save us from one type of pollution, and are we taking on another type of pollution? So one of the things about technology is that I would see that we should invent a light bulb that uses less power but also does not incorporate mercury, which means we have to have a mercury source for those light bulbs, and we have to dispose of them. In California, fluorescent light bulbs have to be contained in a container that does not break and has to be taken to a waste site. So we have to think about what technologies we have, invent good ones, but we also have to use the ones we already have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like actually, I've already received lots of questions, so maybe it would be enough with what we have right here. Actually, let me have a different question for Mr. Patusari. This question says, how do UNFF prevent illegal logging happening everywhere, including Papua New Guinea? I'd like to go back to Dr. Peterson. Actually, your presentation concerning the jet and its effects on California raises a question that makes a lot of sense. So after what you're saying, the questioner is asking, what are you suggesting for us to do? Should we basically fly less? Is this the solution? And particularly in a country like America, where, we say, airplanes is as, common as trains in our parts of the world. Thank you.
I'm not suggesting that we fly less. What I am suggesting is that we can make our jets less polluting. And there is some efforts in the United Kingdom right now to make jets less polluting, to begin to clean them up. But you have to know that persistent jet contrails are not produced solely by commercial airlines. There are many of the jet contrails that you see are private planes. They are military planes. So what happens here is that we have a broad-based problem. We can fly jet airplanes without leaving persistent jet contrails. It was done in the 60s and the 70s. And we can reformulate the fuel, make the jets less polluting, and there are things that we can do right now that would begin to take care of some of the problems. And we can work on the problem of nitric acid and reducing the emissions of nitric acid. So there are formulations, there are things that we can do, and we have some of the best. For all these problems, we have some of the best people in the world that have some of the most brilliant ideas. And I'm sure that we can find a solution working together.
Dr. Peterson is very well handwritten. I have to read it. Land use practice studies includes urban. Percent of the world's population is urban. Government and developers face the dilemma of providing decent housing to at least 1 billion people, many of whom are unemployed. How could we link the provision of urban housing to production of food by the beneficiaries of the housing, creating jobs for them at the same time? Thank you. Probably that was for you.
I can speak to this because in Sacramento, California, much agricultural land right now is turning into miles and miles of tract homes. These tract homes, they're not providing public transportation. There's going to be more and more demand for cars. And our beautiful agricultural land is never going to be available again in the near future to produce food crops. The situation here is that we have to build differently. We need to build a little bit higher possibly, and we need to not put in these miles and miles of tract homes which cover agricultural land. And this is happening in the Central Valley. This is happening in many areas. So we have to find ways to design communities which become able to exist within our agricultural land so that we can keep most of the land in crop production. And this is a problem that we're going to face across the United States and around the world. As we need more food, there's going to be more demand for land to produce it, but also, as we have more people, there's going to be a demand for housing. And I think we have to design housing communities. And in several areas in California, they're designing housing communities which use little land. And they take land that is not agricultural land. They take land that is undesirable for agricultural production to put into usage for housing. So I think that this is something we have to look to in the future instead of covering over and paving over. We talk about global warming, but paving over our land for housing tracts and
since we have two university professors on the panel here, I got a rather interesting question. We had some competing figures on whether we should plant 1 tree or 2 trees. And here the questioner is asking whether we should plant 1 tree or 2 trees. And here the questioner is asking whether we should be, I hope it's not a mandatory requirement, but whether each student be required to plant at least 11 trees to qualify for graduation in high school and colleges. What do you think, Doctor? I'm so glad I graduated 20 years ago. Please. Dr. Peterson, you want to take this, please? Thanks.
I think we all should plant trees. I think that that's very, very important. But we also have to discover right now why 83% of the trees in the Sierra Nevada are dying. We have to look at why the trees, the newly planted trees to replace dead and dying Douglas fir, are also dying. So one of the things that we're looking at, whether it's Connecticut and a plan to cut down all of the trees in a certain area of Connecticut without finding out why they're in deteriorating condition, and why Senator Dianne Feinstein made the suggestion that we should cut down trees in the Sierra Nevada without putting one dime of money into finding out why we were losing so many of our precious trees. So yes, I think everyone should plant trees. But remember, it's planting trees and it's caring for them and getting them started, and also to find out why we're having such deteriorating problems at this time. So, but yes, I think so for graduation, certainly.
But not 11 trees.
Can I contribute to that?
Please, 11 trees first.
Yeah, 11 trees is fine. Just an additional point. Yes, let's plant trees, but it also matters what type of trees we do. Like in many areas where you have experienced dieback and forests are dying, it is because these are introduced species which are not perfectly adapted to that environment. We are also facing the same phenomenon now because of the climate change. So the best medicine against that dieback would be to plant and use and regenerate trees which are very well adapted to those conditions, native species, the first one. And then the nature will take care of that. If these native species cannot survive, nature will bring up something else, shrub or something else. But introduced species is a mistake in our history.
Please, go ahead, Doctor.
There's an irony here, too. Just upon at the end, there's a wonderful book out right now called The Earth Without Us. You might be familiar with that title. It's worth reading. And on the cover, it shows a landscape of a city, and then on the bottom, on the same icon, it shows trees. You can have both of these things. I was just going to say it's ironic.
Dr. Peterson, whether basically concerning your expertise in technologies, whether you have some closing remarks on the technologies that you're proposing that could be sort of made into a viable economic issue that could be used in other non-rich countries like the United States, the issues concerning the jet trails and all the other technologies that you're suggesting to protect the environment in places like California. Could experiments like this be applied in rather underdeveloped continents like Africa or Asia, for example, or Latin America for that matter? Continents like Africa or Asia, for example, or Latin America for that matter?
The technologies for use of microbes to clean up pollutants and to better in other words, water problems and sludge problems around the world is available now and can be used in countries. The other thing about developing countries, I think, is that the industrialized nations and also the United States impact upon, in other words, developing nations to a great degree. We use a lot of their resources, and one of the things that we have to do in a developing society is to use our technology that we already have to start to reduce the pollutants, to start to reduce our impact on these other countries. And one of the things that I think is that agriculture is extremely important worldwide, and I think that water is probably going to be one of the greatest issues. And to say that one country can modify its weather and impact another country is not something and not a direction that we wish to go. And I hope that developing countries are really become aware of what some of the bigger nations are doing with regard to modifying the weather, with regard to putting chemicals in the atmosphere that impact all of us, and to start to be able to unite together to say no to these, to some of the things that we are doing as far as weaponizing space and the technologies that put up chemicals to do so. These type of things we all need to go and join together so that we don't have these problems in the future. And we can fly jets today without leaving persistent jet contrails. In other words, it was done before, it can be done again. And we can do things that are going to benefit everyone, and we can reduce our pollutants, which will not only, which in closing I'm going to say, will make life and health better for all peoples and reduce the costs in human health. It will reduce the costs to people that are going to suffer lots and lots of diseases and things that are brought upon by the use of chemicals, and we can do things in a better way. And that's one of the reasons that I talk about microbes and say that we can do things without having a chemical base. And that is what developing countries and that is what we as the United States should be engaged in, is finding a better way. And the technology to that exists. So I hope that all of you will be able to take into consideration some of these issues and understand that we live in a global closed society, and what we do here impacts everyone around the world. Thank you very much.
One concluding remark from Mr. Patusari, the end of this panel, if he'd like to.
Thank you. Let me thank, first of all of you for your very active role here. I'm really surprised. I didn't quite expect such an audience. I'm very honored to have this chance to talk to you. I'm a simple forester by training, and I also believe that a certain amount of humbleness is important to make things happen. There's so much competition, so much people trying to make their lives better by competing and running fast after money and property and recognition. And I think this is one of the reasons why we are constantly actually also creating additional problems like climate change. So we should a little bit try to reduce the pace of this running exercise in our lives, but at the same time study carefully to understand better how to live in harmony with the nature. We all are carrying with us the nature in our genes. You know, it's not too many generations ago when everybody was living within a forest, and we are still kind of having a desire of being there, enjoying that nature, and this gives us strength. It gives us as much better understanding of who we are, what we are doing. Simple life. Sometimes it was poor, but it made us feel good. And I would tell everybody the same what I experienced from my own father, that just take your son to the lake, nearest lake, to row with your son or with your father. Do some fishing, hoping that there's some fish left. Enjoy the nature and be in harmony with it. And you make a change around you because you start kind of shining this harmony to your compatriots and people living and who are important to you, near to you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists very much for all the contributions. I am very sorry for any questions that I missed, but some of them were repeated, some of them I'm really unfortunately I couldn't read their handwritings. I'd like to thank them all. I'd also like to thank our translators who've been doing a great job. Shukran, merci, muchas gracias, and we all have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Problem Krimajdan needed safe $20 billion cut in a century's arches as well as $1 money for $25 billion.